I just want to get what I'm going to say tonight in proper perspective in spite of all those lovely words of the introduction. So that you get what I say into proper perspective, let me quote something which some of you may already know from Mark Twain, who might have been speaking about people like me when he once said, "In the real world, the right thing never happens in the right place at the right time. It is the task of journalists and historians to rectify this error." So I'm going to rectify the world a little bit tonight to look at the origin of a major phenomenon of our time, and I think of our future, increasingly so, the question of why technology appears to have split the human race into two, divided apparently between those artistic and those generally described as scientific, and in the process, why technology seems to have downgraded the artistic to a secondary interpretative role rather than figuring as a leading edge generator of social change. And I think what I'm going to try and do is to show that this origin may lie in a single act of technology. So let me start with the way single acts can have such big deal effects. The great lexicographer and bon viveur, Dr. Johnson, once said that the only good thing to come out of Scotland was a road south. Something else did too, I suppose, as one of the more ho-hum side effects of the union of Scotland with England in 1707, which was the way the union opened the door for Scottish whisky distillers to export their delicious amber nectar to the hard-drinking English and the even more hard-drinking American colonies. The result of this change in their economic position, apart from an economic boom that made even Glasgow livable, was that the whisky makers became seriously interested in improving their efficiency so as to make much more scotch for this much bigger market with much less raw materials so as to make much more money. One of the ways they set about trying to do this was by hiring a guy called Joe Black to work out how to get more bang for their buck distillation-wise. Now, Black looked at all the aspects of the whisky distilling operation, at how much wood you had to burn to get how much heat for the boilers, at how much water you needed to pour onto the distilling vessels in order to condense the whisky vapors. And it was during this inebriating process that he came across the reason it took such a gigantic amount of cold water to condense steam, because steam, he discovered, was so scalding hot because it contained what he described as hidden latent heat, loads of it. This discovery showed Black's colleague, James Watt, how to make the steam engine get more bang for its buck, which in turn gave you the railroads that opened the West, because they gave Sam Morse a reason to snitch and rename a certain communication code from his colleague Vail, for use on the telegraph, which was so essential to the efficient functioning of your railroads, because they were running on single tracks, so you had to tell another train that one was coming. A telegraph that triggered almost immediately research into why it did what it did, electromagnetic signal transmission, which research eventually revealed the existence of subatomic particles, from which it was a short step to the biggest bang for any buck. All the whole thing took, oh no, it gets much worse. I'm thinking of taking a doctorate in superficiality. All the whole thing took was that minor tweak to the course of history, the otherwise totally forgettable union of Scotland with England. A fine example of the way a nudge at the right time will constrain the juggernaut of change to move one way or another. History, I maintain, is a sequence of such nudges, some more equal than others. For instance, a minor nudge. Back in the same country, in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in the 18th century, that same union with England and the rising economic strength of the country had the local merchants very socially mobile upwards, where they soon bumped into the old established wealth of the UniverCity and all the clubs it fostered, none of which was going to accept any Johnny-come-lately economic hustlers into their upper-class sanctums. Now, looking around for a little backup, these merchants found themselves a couple of Viennese quacks who were peddling a new idea, that you could tell somebody's psychological makeup from the bumps on their head. If you were a good lover, for example, you had a big bump behind your left ear. Don't check. But these Viennese quacks did have a serious purpose, which was that bump reading might give you a handle on character, and that might help when it came to the new kind of social work that was beginning at the time. Well, in the long run, phrenology, the name for this pseudoscience, never was much help to the Scottish trader yuppies, but it did get an Italian social worker, for instance, interested in trying to relate criminality and physical characteristics, and led directly to criminology and penology and other social programs. And the bumps themselves, of course, got people quite interested in digging down to see what lay beneath them. And that led to what we now call neurophysiology and the study of brain function, all because somebody got blackballed at the club. Now for a major nudge. According to a fairly recent theory, about 3.8 billion years ago, in the warm ooze of primeval lagoons lay tiny crystals of clay, doing what crystals always do, growing new layers, repeating themselves exactly, replicating themselves and any flaws in their structure exactly. Crystal life, if you like, repeating generation after generation exactly. But some of the flaws in the crystals apparently had surfaces whose electrical properties preferentially attracted certain kinds of atoms from the surrounding gunk to come and stick to these flaws, and over time these huddled molecular groupings began themselves to repeat every time the crystal repeated. And when some passing energy molecules happened along, joined the group, the molecules had become so good at repeating themselves that now energized, they were able to start doing it without the aid of their crystal host. So a tiny molecular event, a subatomic nudge, and there, instead of a silicon-based life form here tonight, is you. The carbon-based life form, thanks to what is described by this theory as genetic takeover. Life, if you will, imitating art. And what I'm trying to say with all those examples there is that all the way along, small events, nudges, if you like, change the course of history, and after the nudge, you're on a path to the future you might not have been without the nudge, and not on any of the other paths that you might have taken. One of the more interesting new paleoanthropological theories says that human development gets nudged in exactly the same way, that the human brain originally evolved to handle a wide set of potential environments, and then, according to what circumstances turned out to be, narrows its options to fit. So that, for example, there were Shakespeare, Mozart, Michelangelo genes in the caves, since genes are immortal as long as their carrier survives, and since Shakespeare and the others got born, then those ancient genes had to be there all along, all the time. But until conditions facilitated the expression of those genes remained dormant, so to speak. I mean, who knows what gene you may have here waiting for the same kind of release. If you just hold it until I've finished, that'll be good. Now, you can see this kind of brain being ready for anything business that I'm talking about in much more contemporary terms, in the way, for example, children handle language. All children appear to be born with the ability to speak any language. And you can see that in the way that the brain registers a thing called the second formant. Second formant is part of the energy structure of a speech sound, and the energy shape of the second formant depends on the sound coming next. So it kind of prepares you ahead of time so as to make comprehension less of a hassle. Thus, for example, the second formant in the energy spectrum of the sound V is different in V followed by horse from that in V followed by trombone. So your brain can get ready for the clatter of hooves and not a brass band. This phenomenon, of course, is why you are giving this speech a millisecond before I do. One wonders why you came. Anyway, apparently babies can do that with any language, and then when their local world turns out to be, Greek or Chinese or German or whatever, they dump all the other ability with all the others, and retain it only with the one in their local world. And the brain appears to do that kind of selective activity in all areas of what it does, in reaction to the demands made by the environment in which it appears to find itself. So what I'd like to start by doing is to look at history, and therefore, of course, the future, in terms of the effects of that kind of environmental constraint on us, but in regard to one particular kind of environmental constraint, and at what that might mean in the light of my remarks about history being a series of nudges. It seems to me that you can look back at what has brought us to where we are, not just in terms of natural evolutionary selection, but also in terms of the technological and information environment with which we live, and take that as a generator of a series of environmental nudges that move our social development at any time selectively more in one direction than another. The earliest of these selective nudges was perhaps the most important, since it kind of set the basic direction in which we were socially constrained to go from then on. I speak, of course, about the effects of the emergence of the first tool, the prehistoric stone axe. Up to that point, about 2.5 million years ago, natural evolution seems first to have favored those earlier hominids who had characteristics adapted to contemporary environmental constraints, which generated, for example, the need to stand upright when they came out of the forests and into the savannah, and then favored those whose brains were large enough to handle the increasing demands for information processing as life in the upright environment became more complex than that of the one when you walked on all fours. Let me suggest then that things changed. The axe happened, the first major nudge from a new human-generated technological environment which would act selectively just like the natural environment in that it would direct human social evolution to favor those of us who could adapt to the forms of thought that technology would bring and disfavor those of us who couldn't. So following my nudge theory, the appearance of the axe would figure as the first great proto-nudge, constraining our social development once and for all in a technological axe-maker direction, which is what happens consequently. Back in the cave, now that axe-makers exist, those of us capable of making the tools succeed rather well. Those of us best capable of teaching others to make the tools turn out to be those who can transmit the knowledge most effectively. So people teaching axe-making and who can go on beyond gesture to develop speech do best of all. And the key thing here in that theory is that speech develops to mediate an event, axe-making, which is sequential, linear. And that in its process then, language does the same thing. It analyzes the world, it dissects it, it breaks it down into a series of sequential events. And in doing so, moves the early human mind preferentially away from earlier, perhaps more holistic forms of thought. That therefore, in a sense, language itself acts like a technological constraint. It acts like the axe. It's almost as if those who develop language early on are those who already have these reductionist leanings. And there now appears to be little doubt that all this went on a good deal earlier than I was taught at school, for example. I mean, the mutation rates of a particular kind of DNA that descend through the mother suggest that everybody on the planet may well be descended from the same black African woman who lived about 200,000 years ago and who represents one of the first anatomically modern humans. Some other studies of the modern geographical distribution of certain blood constituents would seem to indicate that we anatomically modern humans then come out of Africa about 100,000 BC and spread across the planet, led by our axe makers carrying their lightweight stone tool-making kits, first up the Nile Valley and across the Sinai, and then fanning out west to Europe and east to Asia, Australia, and eventually here. And everywhere the colonizers stop and settle, their axe makers produce the tools that they need to survive in those local conditions. In the northern temperate zones, close to the ice line, really difficult conditions make most demands on and generate the most complex technological results from northern axe makers from a very early stage. And they come up principally, I suppose most important of all, with needles, so that they can make clothing from animal skins for us to survive the winters. Elsewhere, the local axe makers produce long knives to cut jungle bamboo, harpoons and fish hooks for the people who settle along the shores, or specialist spear throwers for the people who remain on the savannas. But above all, axe maker tools all do the same thing. They enhance the carrying capacity of the planet, of the environment, in terms of how many humans it will feed, clothe, and house. And this, as you'll hear later, will turn out to be a hot issue. I talked earlier about the way environmental constraints cause us to activate only those processes in the brain relevant to contemporary circumstance. Does this mean, what I'm saying then, that the hand axe might have put many of the non-tool related mental networks that we might have had available for use in different circumstances kind of onto the neurological back burner for 100,000 years? Because the history of successful proliferating human groups from that point on, that first great nudge, stays strictly in axe-maker mode. The point of this whole preamble is that I want to show that what happens from then on till now is a kind of conflict between evolutionary systems. On the one hand, the limitation by axe-maker selection, primarily to those few who will fit the constraints of the technologically driven environment which the tool has created. On the other, the natural evolutionary push to survive best through species flexibility, through variety. Let me look for a second at that survival through variety thing. There seems to be a process through which those organisms survive best and develop beyond what you might call the Southern California life form. You know, get born, lie on the beach, die. Those organisms survive best which react to natural environmental change, and the environment, of course, does change every day, every night and day, every season, by turning themselves into varieties, each able to live off specialist local conditions, so that whatever happens, at least one of the varieties will survive, and through that variety, at least one version of the species. In that sense, of course, variety really is the spice of life, because variety, increased complexity of species organization, means a more flexible response to change repertoire, and flexible response is the key to handling anything that nature throws at you. However, in the new techno environment that we've generated in the caves, have we limited the scope of that variety? Because the axe has limited the number of directions in which we can then go. Well, it's only limited in a very loose sense, I suppose, because the impression one gets is that the great Axmaker nudge back beyond 100,000 years ago set up pretty much the general conditions of modern life in one fell swoop. It generated a hierarchy. The berry gathering that went on earlier may not have needed a leader, but tools made hunting possible, and the instantaneous and dangerous conditions of a group hunt, not to mention the need to plan the hunt, certainly do demand a leader, and muscles. So the result of these new qualifications, as a result, there are now going to be two kinds of people, primary and secondary people. So women are selected for the inferior stay in the cave role they have had since. And the emergence of the leader concept brings follow me and do as I say, which brings who is not for me is against me, and all that ideological stuff about I'm the only one around here who knows the truth. It can't therefore have been long before they were into similar related subjects like right and wrong, ethics and values, the group divided between initiates admitted to the toolmaking mystery, ordinary slobs, and women, an official view of existence, that is, religion, taboos to violate and be punished for, and above all, the good old, we've always done it this way tradition that vitiates society from then on. Highly affecting and enduring constraints, all of those. I could as easily as the cave have been describing what goes on in General Motors. Because here, of course, we're talking about institutions. Institutions from the axe hierarchy on have only one purpose in life, to perpetuate themselves and the truth they enshrine. If what you're going to do with your tool is explode the variety of things your group can do, because the group will survive better because you do, then you are going to need to keep a grip on things so that variety doesn't mean anarchy. Institutions are just right for that, and they are the beginning of the exclusive, keep out the non-linear thinking specialization. At first, it's just a shaman and helpers daubing the walls and carving extraordinary lunar hunting calendars on batons made of stone or antler around 25,000 BC, so that only they know, and only they can pass on to their successors with the staff of office, what the moon will look like, for example, the day before the right moment, when the salmon will come up the rivers and be chased by the seals, both of which you can eat, because the dates and the relevant animals are carved on the batons of office I mentioned. I've often wondered whether that ancient artifact is the beginning of the ancient folk myth we have about magic wands. So anyway, these reading, talking, Axmaker people proliferate and get more varied and specialize some more. Shellfish gatherers by lakesides, forest harvesters, game chasers on the savannah, and the magic wands have become a complexity generator that stimulates the group to look for other uses of symbols for other things besides the moon and animals. By about 10,000 BC in Iraq, Axmaker brains are having to react to the population surge, which their enhancement of environmental carrying capacity has generated. They come up with new ways of hacking at nature to nudge it further in their favor, and the first dry farming begins, which will in turn accelerate the population surge between 7,000 BC and 2000 BC by something like 60 times. This latest Axmaker marvel, agriculture, is accompanied by the next use of symbols, symbol tokens for corn or livestock, and that's the first writing, and it all says the same thing. This stuff is mine. And it's another major nudge because the scribbling Mesopotamian Axmaker nerd just loves lists. If you look at the first Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets, they are all lists. So writing is the new thing to be into, you're good at that. You can be a scribe, next best thing to being boss, more esoteric magic knowledge. And by the way, if you're going to make lists, you might as well use them to organize the farming better, so hieroglyphs favor more social differentiation, more specialization, more technocracy. So besides the scribbling nerds, you develop priests, kings, soldiers, traders, irrigation engineers, and then off the backs of them, craftsmen living off your new food surplus, goldsmiths, doctors, architects, builders, hookers, shoemakers, weavers, and so on. And all these people are not doing it in the desert or in some cave. They're doing it where the axmakers have put them, in the world's first cities. As the old song had it, how are you going to keep them down on the farm now that they've seen Jericho? And another irrevocable nudge. And the first proper division of the community into those good at using axmaker products, now including the new axmaker concept of writing sequential thoughts with sequential marks, which we call literacy, and those not good. So now we have a technocratic elite using the artists among them as publicists, and the common herd. But as I said, variety is good for you. It makes the community more flexible in the face of change. So in a limited way, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Harappa, the cities along the Ganges thrive and multiply and spread the word that there's only one new way to live, downtown. We, with the benefit of hindsight and from the other end of centuries of axmaker propaganda on the subject, refer to this as civilization. However, now we're set on these tracks, the flavor of the month for the new mind that is running the place, let's call it the Axmaker mind, the flavor of the month is what you can do with tools like make more tools. So technological innovation is born, and with it more specialization, and with that, the division of labor, and a world where you as an individual no longer need to know all the things that you need to do for the group to survive. The responsibility for your survival now being delegated to others. There are, wait for this, things that not everybody needs to know. Especially the poor, backward types who can't read, write, do math, trade, sail ships, make maps, or run the libraries where all this esoteric knowledge is now housed, but where you need a reader's card to get in. And this is where the greatest of all institutional cons in history comes in. The guys who happen to be good at this ancient axmaker speak spread the word that if the axmaker-generated institutions are left alone to run things, innovation will be encouraged and managed so as to make everybody's life rosier. Translation: institutions exist to perpetuate themselves, and only if possible with the glowing approval of those outside. Innovation, I'm saying, is usually generated by institutions with the short-term purpose of getting better at keeping what they've got, and never intentionally in order to bring about their own demise. So when the next great nudge comes, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through 3,500 more years at this rate, when the next great nudge occurs, it's aimed at entrenching the institutions as firmly as possible. The alphabet apparently comes out of a Phoenician accountant running a turquoise mining franchise for the ancient Egyptians at a place down in the Sinai called Serebet el-Khadem, around about 1700 BC. And the only purpose appears to have been to make better sense out of all the hieroglyphic gobbledygook that the various communities use, the better to do contracts with these people, keep Egypt in the vanguard of turquoise futures, and incidentally keep this Phoenician in his job. The fact that the alphabet also generates the extraordinary new capability of recording sequentially conceptual thought and allows people almost immediately to move from hieroglyphic simplicities like dig, irrigation, trench to alphabetic complexities like, metaphysically speaking, I'm a Republican myself, is no doubt the last thing our Phoenician accountant had in mind. Still, no sooner does it do that than in turn it is used to strengthen the establishment. The first great early abstract questions which the alphabet permits among the early Greek philosophers are questions aimed at understanding how things work. They're better to use the environment to axmaker advantage. Like, what are the stars? And incidentally, can we use them to navigate by and get back to port with all the goodies? What is law, and how can we structure it the better to keep axmakers in charge? Can geometry be a reliable, unchanging measure of an ever-changing universe? And incidentally, produce the tools for distance by triangulation so that we can work out how far out the ship with the cargo is on its way in and nip down to the market and fiddle the prices accordingly. This is what I meant by the first great con. These are the first expressions of what those involved vociferously describe as free inquiry on behalf of the axmakers. No, like most inquiry of its type, no more free than the immortal free lunch we all know doesn't exist. But free inquiry is a convenient rallying call leading the nerds to greater efforts at innovation and even tighter constraints on our general freedom of non-technical mental movement. And besides, how can you stop them? Over the following centuries, you're the average Demeter, Cassius, Arthur, Hildegard. What do you know? Out of the political councils, the church synods, the armorers' forges, the alchemists' laboratories, the printing house editing rooms, the stuff starts to pour faster than you can read about it, if you can read. And don't forget, up through the last century, something like 99.999 recurring % of humanity can't read. Meanwhile, fame and fortune continue to be showered on those among an already tiny axe-maker minority who can spring the greatest surprises on the rest of us slobs. Because the end result of the great axe-maker constraint is specialization, and specialized knowledge is esoteric knowledge, so what else would it do but surprise? And I mean surprise, even to a bunch of creme de la creme like you. Here's a bit. You have hindsight. You know, this is fairly recent. You should know where I'm going before I get there. After World War II, you're a visionary. You invest heavily in refrigeration. Terrific. How can you go wrong before you know it? Freezers in every home, air conditioning in every car, everywhere you look. One of the really fancy things that keeps your stock in this chili business sky high, in more senses than one, is the way refrigeration can be used to generate tons and tons of cryogenic fuel, like liquid hydrogen for ICBMs and rockets to the moon and so on. One day, one of the satellites that your frozen fuel lofts into orbit happens, thanks to the work of somebody in one of the thousands of other gobbledygook axe-maker disciplines a million miles away from refrigeration, happens to find this gigantic hole in the ozone layer. Chief criminal CFCs, chief user of CFCs, refrigeration, there goes your portfolio. Try another one. The 18th century Italian Alessandro Volta invents an electric glass bomb. Round glass vessel filled with methane. In through the cork goes a wire, out through the other side goes another wire. Send electricity in, the electricity jumps the gap between the two bits of wire. Boom! The bomb bombed. However, a century later, a German engineer puts that idea together with a perfume spray filled with gasoline and comes up with what we call the carburetor. Another one. An English chemist looking for a way to make artificial quinine because our administration chaps out in the Far East are dying like flies from malaria, fails. Comes up with some interesting sludge. One thing it is not is artificial quinine, chucks it down the sink, becomes a millionaire overnight because he discovers that he's accidentally invented the world's first artificial aniline dye. Makes his money in typically British fashion by selling the idea to a German. However, a few years later, a couple of guys looking for the cure for anthrax, or indeed the source of anthrax, and in 1882, one of them leaves some anthrax tissue in a culture dish overnight on a warm stove, and somehow accidentally some of this dye spills into it. Next morning they wake up, and there are the bugs they're looking for, preferentially stained blue. Bingo, bacteriology. I could have gone on all night, and you see what I mean about surprises. Given all that, the technological, sequentially thinking, reductionist knowledge environment within which selection for survival and success takes place has now been firmly constrained to everything descended from the axe-maker's first product. And almost always each step, each nudge, each narrowing of the way has accidentally or deliberately been an expression of the conservatism of the institutions. We move ineluctably along the path of knowing more and more about less and less. Boosted on one occasion along the way, as perhaps at no other time in history, by the techno-speak of the 16th century Catholic Church. Around about 1500, we're living, as I'm sure you know, in an Aristotelian universe. Earth at the center, surrounded by glass onion skins, each one carrying a planet or the stars. Everything in its proper place. Techno-proof that some of us are supposed to be inferiors, ignorant, slobs, or whatever, obedient to our natural masters. Okay, minor problem, because the universe doesn't really work like Aristotle says. Easter gets out of whack. And we are just not up to the astronomical math to get it right, but right it has to be, or we'll all end up eating meat on Fridays because we think it's Tuesday. Urgent calendar reform is needed. When Copernicus finally does come up with the math, it's also with a totally different sun-centered universe. Well, that's a blow to the institutions, but nothing to the discovery at the same time of this place. America didn't figure in the Bible, so what the hell was it doing there? In the panic to batten down the hatches or shore up the defenses or whatever, there is a desperate search for some new way of generating axe-maker knowledge that'll be so foolproof we'll risk no more surprises. By we, of course, I mean we, the institutions. So the search is on for certainty. And the Elizabethan legal eagle Francis Bacon comes up with a guide to simple thinking. Order, he says, that's what we need, and analysis. His plan, adopted enthusiastically by all, is to break knowledge up, specialize it even further, divide it among even more Axmaker brains. Shortly later, in the same vein, things are tightened up even more by one René Descartes. I'll paraphrase what he did. First of all, he changed, as I say, tightened up. I think what he did was to change radically the way we looked at what knowledge was supposed to be. Before he did his thing, we kind of wandered around saying, credo ut intelligam. I believe, and through my belief I come to an understanding. After Descartes, we'd switched it the other way round, intelligo ut credam. Rough translation, when I have examined the proposition for traps, I'll get back to you. And he said very simply, look, never take anybody's word for it. If they tell you it's certain, think of it as probable. If they call it probable, think of it as possible. And if the word is it's possible, forget it. And he said, reduce every problem to its smallest parts, and then you'll be able to put it back together again. Now, from all that, two major modern Axmaker constraints emerge. A few years afterwards, the Dutch prince and military whiz Maurice of Nassau applies the idea of ordering, analyzing, and reducing to the minimum parts to the matter of loading and firing muskets. This is a problem. His musketeers are taking so long to load and fire their guns that they get clobbered before they do so. In producing what is now called military drill, Maurice of Nassau also generates the mega constraint that will become known as the production line, which the Industrial Revolution will jump at. The other effect is that Descartes and Bacon's orderly thought and methodical doubt specialization gives the Axmakers the magic techno-thinking rules for what we now call science, which rapidly comes up with wonders like steam power and bleach and iron making, which the Industrial Revolution will also jump at. And with the Industrial Revolution, the greatest ever Axmaker triumph, here comes another bunch going at it for all they're worth, screwing in the constraints even tighter, the Industrial Revolution factory owners, whose laudable aim is to invent the working day, wages, sell everybody pots and pans and sewing machines and Quaker oats, the democracy of possessions that made this country great, and incidentally get seriously rich in the process, and above all, stay in business from then on. As well, key nudge this, is the Industrial Revolution's consequent and evident need to direct the aim of public education down the ever-narrowing path of increasingly specialist Axmaker competence. And this is where I suppose I'm going to get into trouble with some of you, because this 19th century is when our educational systems might have held out for a little more than vocational, factory-oriented curricula. After all, it was the so-called age of enlightenment at the time. Except fat chance. How could they, already constrained by a mandate to train for an Axmaker community, to begin the process of even narrower selection of those with Axmaker abilities, to invent the modern equivalent of the priesthood or the bone-reading shaman, known as the PhD, the BSc, the MA, the DLit, the BPhil, the BA, Dip-Env studies, and any other gobbledygook label you choose, through a system based on a medieval process for training monks, which inclines by its very mandate towards highly limited selection, with the primary aim of failing the majority so as to leave only as many as the system can use or reward or put to making metaphorical axes. Perfectly logical way for an educational system to work, given its purpose. I said a while back that the clearest expression of the constraint we have operated on since the Axe is the conservatism expressed at every turn by the institutions established at each nudge down the Axmaker path. My favorite example of how powerful and ongoing this conservative, defensive, negative reaction is from the history of technology starts with the so-called recovery of the European economy after the so-called Dark Ages. What kicks the economy into high gear sometime in the 11th century is the arrival from Arab Spain of a new kind of loom. Big deal, it has foot pedals. What that does is free the weaver's hands to throw the shuttle back and forward, make tons more cloth, much more quickly, much more cheaply. The weaving corporations of Northern Europe smash every one of these looms they can find because they say it'll put people out of work. Remarkably modern thinking for the 11th century. However, market forces obtain. A generation later, the dust is settled, the loom is in use, and now the people rioting are the thread-making guilds because they can't keep up. They're teasing the stuff out of the mass until their problem is solved for them accidentally by the arrival from China of the spinning wheel. Put the wheel and the loom together, and the production of cloth goes up like a rocket. More riots, because the cloth now for the mass market is linen made from plants, which are cheap, rather than wool made from sheep, which are expensive. So this time, the rioters are in the well-established woolen industry. So soon everybody is, however, wearing the new cheap linen, and when they wear it out, throwing it away. So all over Europe, there's this gigantic and growing pile of linen rag. So the price of paper drops like a stone. Linen rag is the best raw material you can have for durable paper, and it's now free. More riots. The woolen industry again. Parchment is sheepskin, and now it's too expensive to use. However, here we are with enough paper to stick on the walls. The scribes are overworked and in demand, and pretty soon the writers' associations are on strike for higher wages because suddenly it's a seller's market. The Black Death has knocked out 1/3 of the population of Europe, the other 2/3 is inheriting, and there is not enough writing ability for all the documentation to go round. Until Gutenberg solves the problem around about 1450 by automating it with the printing press. Riots in that oldest established institution, the Vatican. The Pope needs a printing press like a hole in the head because it will give people what we would now call the ability to free think. Until it is realized that the printing press can be used to generate millions of indulgences with. Now, for those of you who are not Catholic, an indulgence was a kind of spiritual credit note. Pay now, sin later. Anyway, with all the demand for instant printed salvation that follows, Rome makes $1 million money to put up the Vatican, paint various ceilings, pay Michelangelo's bill, and generally get involved in certain prestige projects that make certain German clerics madder than hell at this cash-and-carry view of salvation, one of whom nails up a few remarks, and there, thanks to advances in textile machinery in the 11th century and fought every step of the way by the institutions, is the Reformation. It's a trifle oversimplified, but you get my point. People cannot handle lateral thinking with ease. This defensive institutionalized negative attitude to lateral thinking is extremely powerful, as I said, because once you start on the Axmaker path, there's not supposed to be any deviation. And the further from the start you get, the more difficult generating deviation can be. So we live with institutions that pinion us firmly to that start point. Institutions that act like signposts, telling us we're going in the right direction by obliging us to look backwards all the time for what, for good Axmaker reasons, we call traditions. A few. Modern international diplomatic structures that date unchanged from the letter-writing era. A working day designed to fit the availability of transportation and artificial light at the time of the steam engine. A political system based on representative democracy that hasn't been dusted off since it was the solution to the problem of lousy roads in the 18th century. A Protestant work ethic that allows true believers to lay up riches in heaven by laying them up on earth that dates from the days of the Mayflower. The talking shop known as Parliament from around 1300. An educational system, as I mentioned earlier, from the late Middle Ages. An Anglo-Saxon legal system with long-forgotten reasons for 12-people jury systems and verbal proceedings because people back then couldn't read or write. Religious practices from the Middle Eastern deserts of 1500 BC. City life from ancient Egypt. A male-female relationship unaltered since the caves. Above all, a brain capable of miracles, but obliged to adapt only to an Axmaker environment since at least 200,000 years ago. I believe it was Einstein who said, "We're all born with magnificent brains, which formal education then destroys." Don't get me wrong, I am not denigrating all that the Axmakers have given us. We live longer, healthier, wealthier, better informed, freer to think and speak as we wish than ever before. Each one of us has power at our fingertips undreamt of by a Roman emperor. Thanks to medicine, we are literally the survivors of disease vectors that would have wiped us off the planet only a few decades ago. But nonetheless, we are perhaps not what we might once have been. The reverse of the progress medallion is a world in which 99% of the people are illiterate and have no say in what shapes their lives. Even in countries with high literacy figures like this one and mine, we are straitjacketed into a way of life that, while avalanching us with material satisfaction, attempts to buy most of us off with it. We've generated a monolithic paradigm by which to live, the Western, technological, rational, materialist way of life, whose credo often appears to be use it or lose it, in which there are a few 100,000 with special axe-making abilities that give them the opportunity to change the world for the other 4.9 billion, people that Tom Wolfe might once have called the great left behind. In plain language, the immense almost incredible changes which have been wrought over the last 100,000 years alone have been brought about thanks to the effort of something like 0.0000001% of the people who have lived during that time. That's a measure of the world-altering power of a few axe-makers. This is no conspiracy theory I'm espousing here. I don't believe for a second there's some great millennial plot to devalue the non-sequential, non-rationalist, non-reductionist turn of mind. It's just that the only mind selected to succeed in the post-hand axe era is the tool user mind. All other minds need not apply. And in the axe maker environment, there's never been at any one time so far enough tools and systems to go round for more than a few to be involved. Tool-using society has almost by definition had to be two-tier, axe makers and outsiders. And as I've argued elsewhere, the use of artifacts changes the user permanently and irreversibly. And the emergence of a tool in one place will sooner or later trigger the emergence of a different tool in another place, a knock-on nudge, if you like. And above all, axe maker products don't just come in the form of surprising new gizmos. Often they're entirely new ways to live. For instance, a society with print is a totally different place to be, offering different ways to live and think than is a society without print. Consider just a few of the ways in which that bit of axe maker technology generated new kinds of living. Printed maps, updated with every voyage, standardized data, and make it more attractive and less dangerous to sail away looking for profitable cargoes. The few Dutch lunatics who try it early on come home to profits as high as 600%. Everybody wants a piece. The demand for cash to invest in these surefire money winners is such that new ways have to be found to borrow money against your land, the principal unit of wealth at the time. So in England, land registers are set up for the first time, so mortgages can come into existence, and mortgage companies. Some of the borrowing pays for ships, more of it goes to the new insurance brokers set up in business to take the risk out of these adventures. And so as to limit the risk even more and attract more backers, new things called limited joint stock companies are invented, and there's the stock market, with the whole caboodle held together by another new institution necessary to make the whole thing function, called a national bank, offering the supreme facilitator for change, credit, which then needs the entire structure of the credit agency system. And all those career opportunities, new, are only a tiny bit of what print does to life. Sounds terrific, except we're still only talking about a small fraction of the population, because as the number of things to be and grow does, be and do grows, so does the number of people. So what the axe maker mind has been doing for the last 100,000 years, apart from suppressing our non-tool using minds, has been gradually to fill up the world with changing, newer model technological furniture, whose presence shapes, affects our lives, fills it with changing new model values, new model ethics, aims, beliefs, ways of existing. On the other hand, as part of the process, what we call scientific knowledge, the Axe Maker's Handbook, knowledge itself has burgeoned. The last I heard, there were over 20,000 scientific and technological disciplines. So there may be lots of new jobs around, but the immense potential for change represented by each one of those 20,000 sets of axe makers, their immense potential for change grows almost combinatorially as the world becomes more interactive. And it does so in many cases without the active involvement of the specialists themselves. What we have here, in other words, is what one could describe as a plague of nudges. And as the fragmented and isolated change makers do their thing, and as I said before, go on knowing more and more about less and less, the reverse is true for the non-specialist outsider. Greater and greater numbers of the population know less and less about more and more. I have a pal, for example, at Stanford now, who got his doctorate at Oxford when I was up in Milton's use of the comma. Some of you will have heard me say that the general reaction of the average non-involved, non-specialist outsider to this high-tech, high-change daily show always reminds me of the depressive who gets a few days off from the clinic, goes to the beach, gets himself a tan. Day later, his psychiatrist gets a postcard carrying a typical message from the depressive and perhaps most non-axe maker outsiders in the world today. It says, "Having a wonderful time, why?" So has our artificial constraint of the way in which we could have developed back beyond 100,000 years ago by driving ourselves down the axe maker path, has that limited the extent the extent to which we can now ultimately survive, because in doing so, we might well have gone counter to the evolutionary law of success through diversity. If the safest thing to be is multifarious, has driving non-Axmaker thinking underground made the human community more vulnerable? Well, even within the amazingly successful lifestyle the Axmakers have given us, in many ways we have pushed our luck. Whether or not you believe the greenhouse effect is already happening or will bring death and destruction to the planet, since the Industrial Revolution we have at least made ourselves chemically felt in the biosphere at large. What with obliterating entire ecosystems and indiscriminate overuse of fertilizers and pesticides, we seem to be destroying species at a rate estimated to be something like 6,000 a year. Now, since we don't know how many are left, we don't know whether this is cataclysm or just Armageddon. The social effects of the early years of the Industrial Revolution generated ideological differences that until recently brought the planet close to nuclear destruction and gave birth to a political system that pushed the countries run by it for 7 decades close to starvation. The ability of the Axmakers to enhance the carrying capacity of the planet through agricultural tricks like the Green Revolution, as well as the extraordinary reduction in death rate in the Third World with drugs and public health, has also brought us within the population support limit of the planet by 2050 at the latest. It's only a short time ago that we were expending men, women, and material in a Gulf War that was fundamentally triggered by our vulnerability to the disruptive effects of an interruption in oil supplies on a high-tech economic infrastructure we built up in disregard of such an eventual possibility. And as our communicative abilities grow, we've become increasingly aware of that 0.1% of the population who are calling the shots. Not in any dictatorial fashion, I hasten to add, but as a natural consequence of taking the Axmaker route. And we become increasingly aware of the inadequacy of our present institutions meaningfully to inform the majority of our citizens about what those people are doing. Now, we might be living with no more than a future, rather complicated version of what we've lived with ever since a number of ordinary slobs gaped uncomprehendingly at the Axmaker and his shaman sidekick with the magic wand. Except, fortunately, for the brain. Because the end product of this great millennial hand-axe mental constraint may have been the emergence from the same Axmakers, almost in spite of themselves, in the last few decades of a new kind of tool. One that might change the rules, move the goalposts, whatever. I refer, of course, to the latest version of the hand-axe, data processing systems, and their symbiotic partner, telecommunications. I think the convergence of these two systems marks a watershed in our descent from the unhindered mental vistas of 100,000 BC. Because these new technologies could offer us a way to turn the clock back in some very valuable ways. There is no question, is there, but that the proliferation of knowledge through the computer will amply satisfy any demand by the law of evolution for diversity. If the effects of information surge are to generate new ways of living, then in the coming decades, we're going to get that in spades. The question is whether or not the coming information technology will bring, in effect, just several orders of magnitude more of what went before. That is, an even more highly informed, even more powerful, even more reductionist elite, and an even larger, even less informed rest. Or could it be something new? I've heard it said that at 1 operation a second, the computer can equal the tool-using mind in arithmetic. At 100 operations a second in logic. At 10,000 operations a second in chess. And at 1,000,000 operations a second in some expert activities. But that to be the brain's equal in imaginative thought, it would need to operate at 10 trillion operations a second. And that we can expect to be within 1 order of magnitude of that by 2030. Now, I won't analyze imaginative thought because I don't know what imagination is operationally. But 10 trillion operations a second is a significant amount of processing power with which to reproduce some of what we get up to. Even if all it does is to mimic some of our simpler Axmaker habits, like seeking new ways to chop up the universe, well, that'll deal with much of what we have called up to now discovery and innovation. Whichever way information technology goes, most of it will probably, by 2020, 2030, be doing virtually all of the research and development that has so far taken human beings 100,000 pencil-chewing years. There are 1 or 2 problems I'll just touch on. How do the social processes handle that kind of rate of innovation and discovery? How can we accept innovation that cannot be explained by the machine that produced it because we will not live long enough to understand or even hear the whole of the explanation? That's already happening in the field of quantum chromodynamics, I believe, where some of the newer systems can handle equations that would have taken an old mainframe a century. So, do we try to build into these systems some kinds of values to act as some kind of basic social filter to help the machines decide what innovation to pursue and what to drop? And if so, how do you know you're not going to want something before it's been invented? And if you let it emerge before you think about it, who then has the authority to decide that it won't be made public? But the more positive side of this problem may well lie in the way in which the systems could perhaps solve a problem loudly argued about over the years every time you talk about social inequity in our Axmaker world. I mean, of course, the matter of sharing the wealth, both intellectual and material. When in the past it was suggested from time to time that we might call a halt to development in order to expend effort in getting what a few of us have to the majority who haven't, the argument was always that people wouldn't give up their right to a higher standard of living, however well off they already were. I think this is probably true. I believe it would be less of a problem, though, in a world where, with the aid of the new machines, it might take fewer of us to generate those high levels of innovation needed to ensure a rising standard of living. What I'm suggesting is that the next generation of information and communication systems could offer so much spare organizational and innovative capacity as to give us what we've lacked for 100,000 years, the opportunity to give everybody a hand axe, metaphorically speaking. Enough organizational power and then some to run the place, generate new models, make advances in medicine and food production, devise entirely new ways to make money, and still have enough machine capability left for the single most important activity known to humankind: educating the young for self-fulfillment and responsibility towards the rest of their community. The new information systems already suggest it may be possible to circumvent the major obstacle of the medieval education system: lack of individual attention, lack of materials, and above all, the constraint of a single model, Axmaker view of what constitutes intelligence in young people. Some of the experimental hypermedia programs offer very idiosyncratic ways for individuals to learn in their own way, at their own pace, with their own objective, and still come out knowing what the community requires, but having made the journey along paths of their own devising, with knowledge all the more precious because it is of their own making, because they have taught themselves to learn. And telecommunications already makes it possible to bring this opportunity to the poorest, most isolated shack of a schoolroom in the most remote corner of a desert or inner city anywhere. And if we spend half the effort and energy we spent getting conned by Nikita Khrushchev into thinking the moon mattered, we could bring solar power and wind power to those same shack schoolrooms and to the rest of their poverty-stricken countries 20 years from now. I think we will. I think inevitably we will see it makes good, enlightened self-interest to have our innovation machines humming in the back room while most of the Axmakers go out and help to educate the world, if for no other reason than to make them consuming Axmakers like us, buying their tools from us. What a market. Fortunately, I think we'd get more than we bargained for if we did that. I mean, up to now, we have lived in an almost empty world. Yes, there are 4.9 billion out there, but when did you ever hear from them? As the kid says when his mother tells him at the breakfast table, "Eat your cereal, millions are dying in the Sudan," name one. Up to now, the vast majority of illiterate humanity on this planet, the non-Axmakers we left behind millennia ago, has had no voice. With energy independence and the data networks, they will. And the task of integrating ourselves into one global community will begin, because Western technology has not made it a shrinking world. That's only what CNN would have you believe. When I lived in Italy, for example, in the 60s, it was bewailed that television would destroy the cultural customs, the very powerful, long-lived, productive cultural customs of the Italian regions. They'd all be swamped by televisual Italian from Rome. 30 years later, with a television station in every pot, those customs and their dialects and traditions are flourishing more vigorously than since the 16th century. The global network that we are busily constructing now for the business and industrial elite and the political elites will soon become available at what we might call, for want of a better phrase, the grassroots level. But a sudden and massive increase in the number of diverse talents and values and opinions that will be expressed on that network is going to put our axe-making institutions under unprecedented stress. And the UN is no exception. Only the politicians would pretend that it voices in any meaningful way the aspirations of the billions of individuals it claims to represent. Much less, while we're feeling comfortable about this, much less our 18th century so-called representative democracy, with its built-in short-term imperative to shape public policies primarily in order to get re-elected, and expressing itself through a number of political options which are, if you think about it, ridiculously limited in the face of an increasing cultural and intellectual pluralism among the electorate and among the world at large. If we won't take two flavors from Baskin-Robbins, why should we take it from government? Two choices was fine back when the world was simple, not now. So if we are to be ready for the explosion of cultural pluralism, which I believe is coming on the global network, we urgently need to use the technology to prepare people for life in a participatory political arena, where access to any information the individual considers necessary is both unrestricted and untested. Now, I suppose that word untested goes against all axe-making practice. We Western toolmakers have taken a progress-oriented view of history that sees events in terms of onwards and upwards, thanks above all to the manufacture, always, of new forms of specialization, always tested, always qualified. So we see the advent of the coming information systems as some kind of step forward to an even more extraordinary cutting-edge specialization, the brilliant end product of a couple of centuries of reductionist scientific and technological endeavor. But that endeavor, as I said, could have brought us to something surprisingly different from what we might have had in mind. And that's what I meant earlier about being able to turn the clock back. If the network offers those 4.9 billion the means to make themselves heard directly, instead of being represented by authority, it will give them the means to express their individuality in a way up to now denied them. And nobody knows what that will mean. Nobody knows what the free, empowered, informed individual is capable of, because we haven't had any anywhere so far. We don't know what's out there waiting to be set loose. The axe-making techno environment deselected those other forms of talent, thought and expression 100,000 years ago and left them out of positions of power in the jungles, across the deserts, high in the mountains, and in music rooms, art galleries, and poetry classes. Maybe the coming networks will bring those people in from the cold for the first time in 1,000 generations to help us towards what we might, for want of a more pompous metaphor, call a Baskin-Robbins cultural future. Maybe once the techno environment was established all those centuries ago, we were tied in the kind of individual talents we could permit into the process by the limitations of the technology available at any time from then on. And in general, those tools and systems couldn't ever handle the non-sequential thought processes of what we today would call the artistic, the imaginative, the lateral, the disorderly mind. But a billion switches on a chip and supercomputing at $50 will be able. So that's what I really meant about turning the clock back. I'd like to believe that we will soon be able to release the awesome power of the rest of our minds and those of the so-called primitives around the world. And I also think that the argument that art only follows, interprets, and that science leads and shapes and changes the world may be an argument itself the product of the axe-maker technology constraint, and that once that constraint is lifted, a different view will be feasible. I happen to think that the technology to permit that will be here a lot sooner than our institutions are prepared for it. What kind of world would they give us? I don't know. But whatever it is, I think we should be thinking a great deal more in the institutions about the problem now, instead of continuing to live by the old axe-maker view, you know, the one of the fellow who falls off the top of a skyscraper. As he falls past the 17th floor, somebody calls out to ask him how he's doing, and he shrugs and says in a typically late 20th century way, "So far, so good." Thank you. Q&A? No, Q&A, so we just... We can do it? Yeah, sure.
Mr. Burke has agreed to a few questions if anyone has one.
What?
Not,
Bruce says there's time for some questions. Not much time, because I came in from England yesterday and it's 3 in the morning. 4 in the morning. Could we do it this way? If you have any questions, if you'd like to go, just go. If you have a question, raise a finger. I'll choose friendly-looking people.
We could tell a joke.
Repeat their question, rewording it to suit me, and then duck it. Okay, those are the rules. No questions? Terrific.
Okay.
Oh, God, a question. Oh, good, thank you. A difficult question. We have any upcoming shows from me? Yes, yes. I'm doing starting work on a 20-part, don't hold your breath, a 20-part series. Starts in November. The first 10 go out at the end of next year, and the second 10 go out at the end of the following year. And it's about the interactive nature of knowledge. What else? You know, I can only do one tune. I can only cook one spaghetti dish, and I can only do one kind of program. Still, that's what all academics are like, right? There was another question. Yes, ma'am. Do I think that computer nets like internet and bitnet are moving towards what I'm talking about? I don't think so, no. I don't think it's going to come from, well, take a risk here. I don't think it's going to come from inside the computer community. I was at a symposium forum thing in Japan recently, where all the hotshots from the computer industry, very interestingly, had a very private meeting with all the hotshots from the entertainment industry and the telecommunications industry. And I think what came out of that meeting was that it's going to come from entertainment through the phone. In other words, the push is going to be that the fiber optic network will make it possible once, hey, listen, I'm going to insult somebody, but you have to insult somebody, don't you? Once you people do what we're all doing, which is to let the fiber optic go all the way to the front door of a house, instead of having this silly nonsense about, you know, taking it up to the curb and then not into the house. I mean, then you'll be able to shunt stuff into the home, at a tremendous rate, get broadcasting out of the air and send it down, and you have tons of bandwidth to use more sensibly than crowding it with stupid TV. And then that means the end of the networks, hooray. And the quality of programs that are produced when you only have a broadcast network, and therefore the advertisers have to scattergun everything, and therefore only mass advertisers selling cans of beans pay for anything, so you get cans of beans programs. So I think it's going to come the other way around. I think it's going to come because the fiber optic network is going to go into the home, and you're going to be able to call on tons of stuff, and people are going to demand. I think people are going to say, well, I'd like this kind of stuff, and I think that's where the thrust is going to come from, not from inside the computer community, because I don't think the computer community is qualified to do that. I mean, I don't think they know what the market is. I don't think they know what people want in that sense. I worry a little bit about that development because although on the one hand I think it's a good idea if you can have this network supporting people's ability to call on data and to get it in ways that are other than, you know, bulletin board gobbledygook. But I mean, I'm thinking in terms of very extremely modern graphic techniques and so on. What worries me slightly is the way television I think inevitably will go, and in one way that's good because I think with the highly pinpointing techniques that advertisers will be able to use once they've got this fiber system, people like Mercedes will start paying for high-quality programs for people who want to buy Mercedes. And that means that for a few bucks you get the same thing and you get high-quality programs. And if only X% buy the Mercedes, that makes Stuttgart very happy, so they go on funding it. So in other words, I think there'll be a renaissance of quality programming for that reason. But what bothers me slightly is the loss of the forum. I mean, however dreadful CBS, ABC, NBC, BBC, all these people are, I think they provide, however degraded, however second-rate, however produced by people with only one thing in mind, keeping their jobs and all that, they provide at least a commonality of experience for people to talk about. I mean, very few people listen to radio, where I think the last vestiges of quality broadcasting still hang on grimly. So I worry a little about the loss of the public forum, and I don't know what will replace it. What worries me is nothing will replace it. That we will have increasingly less in common. And you know, now and again, whether you like it or not, you leave the TV on while you make a cup of coffee or something, and you accidentally get a bit of documentary work, or you accidentally get a bit of political discussion, whatever. With the fiber optic specialist channels, you won't. If you're a begonia-growing mud wrestling freak, that's all you'll see. Then who'll become president? Sorry. Sir. How are the Axmakers who are in control of the delivery of the material today, how are they going to be moved out? I espouse the hacker theory of history. And I think that ultimately the hacker wins through. And I suppose this might be the first opportunity, this is a very optimistic way of looking at things, but this might well be the first opportunity for the ordinary non-specialist member of the public to act like a hacker. Above all, act with a pocketbook, for example. As for whether or not, you mean the material that is sent, the data that is produced will be, yes. Again, I wonder whether the marketplace will see that away. I mean, 2 minutes after you say cold fusion, 7,000 other people are saying garbage, I think we have a tendency to, well, it's what made America great, it's called competition. So I wonder whether I can't see that you can have any other controls. I mean, the government can't do it. I suppose if there's any hope at all, it's the market, in that sense, that... No, I don't mean the market in that sense. I mean, sorry, I mean the intellectual market. No. Oh, sorry. That's unintentional. Could we get onto thicker ice, please?
I think one more.
Okay, one more, I'm told. Sir. Yes, sir.
What's going to do with 8 billion people in 20, 30 years?
10. Yeah, well, the projection is 10 billion by 2050. Well, there are several things you can do with them. Some of the more optimistic views are that there are 9 acres per person on the planet, 7 of which are, at the moment, unusable, tundra, mountains, one of which is used and the other one is spare. So technically speaking, from straightforward, no progress, business as usual, we'll go on as we are at the moment, theoretically there is enough land to handle a doubling of the population. That begs the issue of whether that land is destroyed by misuse or rendered useless by the kinds of governments that we see in certain parts of Africa at the moment, where I believe half the problem of aid is not that the country has been destroyed, but that the political system, or lack of it there, means that running any kind of country that will produce anything to feed anybody is out of the question. So I think that the other thing I suppose is that I would look to, ideally, the realization that this problem is coming, whether we like it or not, and that the urgent necessity is to find alternate forms of energy, renewable forms of energy and solar energy above all, and that fiscal measures have to be taken which were cut off in this country and 16 years ago. You have to start encouraging people to get into the solar energy business again. So I suppose the energy problem is not as critical as it might appear. I mean, you went to the moon in 10 years, you people. You could do this in 10 years. You could do this alternate energy solution. You could find it in 10 years and make it feasible if you have the political will. The question is whether you have the political will. If you don't do it, nobody else will do it. I don't think. Everybody else is, even Europe, everybody else is falling apart. The difficult thing to bring up in a mixed bag like you is the matter of birth control. The ultimate problem on the planet you put your finger on. I mean, the greenhouse effect and everything else comes from the problem of population. And the problem is how you handle the cultural and religious obstacles to introducing any kind of sensible birth control in many parts of the world, including the United States of America. Remembering that every baby that's born in this country uses 7 times more energy than any baby born almost anywhere else. So it's not a straight equation to say, well, there are X many more people in India. Each one of them uses much less energy than any one of you do. So I suppose ultimately it's a political decision about what you do about population control. Without that, we'll be up to here. So I suppose I'm saying there is no solution except that one. And it seems to me, and I'll really put my foot in it before I leave, that everywhere in the world the problem is not going to be solved by science. It's going to be solved by political will. It's not going to be solved by contraception or abortion. It's going to be controlled by educating women. That one place in the world where there seems to have been massive success in bringing population rates down is in the province of Kerala in India. And that was brought about by a sustained policy on the part of the local government there to radically change the social and educational position of women in the society. And educated women decide whether they want 20 children or not, and in general they don't.